Anyway, good afternoon. This is week 4, Politics of the Dollar. And as you can see from that handout, making society work for the few. That's inspiring. That's inspiring. Just so you know, I've already spoken to them, and I guess we're going to get ready for 2 more in the fall. And I've written one of them up. I got to edit it, and I got to send it in to them, and then I got to write up the second one. So the first one will be Roadblocks to Republic. And the second one will be Revolt of the Planters, which deals with the Civil War, but from the perspective that the Confederacy was a revolution. I'm not going to get into the battles and that kind of stuff. Yes? The library. The library. But I was already told that they'll get together with me and schedule them. So, yeah, squeeze me in. So it'll probably be the same bat time, same bat channel, I guess. Yes. Yeah, a lot of what's about the Civil. Yeah, a lot about the Civil War. There's a lot about the battles and so on and so forth. We kind of lose perspective here as to well, what really caused it? I mean, what's the agenda here? I mean, the Confederacy was a right-wing revolution. That's what it was. Anyway, making society work for the few. If you take a look at that handout, note the quote there. I referenced, I think, this quote last week, but I love this quote, and it comes up from a movie. And it's Eli Wallach in The Magnificent Seven. Remember the premise of that movie? He was a Mexican bandit chieftain, and they kept pillaging the same village, and the villagers didn't know what to do, so they hired 7 American gunmen. Steve McQueen was one of them. And Yul Brynner was the leader of the group. A young, who was it? Was the man from Uncle. Robert Vaughn, yeah, young Robert Vaughn, yeah. And there was a conversation near the beginning of the movie when Eli Wallach finds out they've got these 7 American gunmen, and he says something, a reference of, well, why can't we share in the spoils? He says men from our profession trying to leave to these people is sacrilegious. And he says we're in the same business together. And Steve McQueen pipes up and goes, just as competitors. Interesting. And then he gets to the conversation about, taking as opposed to leaving for the villages. And that's where Eli Wallach says, if God did not want them sheared, he would not have made them sheep. What a line. What a line. Excellent line here. Well, couldn't that be construed as being the American public? There's a discussion for you. But then again, going back to, in that first part of this handout, again, getting back to that book that this gentleman who hunts for books for me, I was able to get, Confessions of a Monopolist, written in 1906. Interesting what Frederick Clemson Howe says. It was really self-interest that led me into politics. And he prefaces this in this book by saying he was really not political at all. By that, and as an elected official. Well, you don't have to be an elected official to be a politician. Witness Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a politician, even though she wasn't an elected official. The city was growing rapidly, and real estate values were going up. I owned a large block of land near the center of the city, which was covered with small buildings that I did not care to replace with larger ones. I had bought the land at a low price and was holding it for speculation. I found its tax valuation going up so fast that it was becoming unprofitable to hold the land. As it was, the rentals scarce met the taxes and charges against the property. I made some inquiries about the local assessor, and prior to the next assessment, went to the county auditor to see if a man whom I employed might not be appointed in that ward. He suggested that he had a fight on his hands for re-election and intimated that a campaign contribution might help my case. I contributed $100 and on his election secured the appointment of a man as assessor whom I could rely. Through him, I was able to keep my assessments down to a reasonable figure. In this way, I made my entrance in the local politics. About this time, I concluded my property would be greatly enhanced in value if the street were paved and sewered. In this matter, I engaged the interest of the alderman from the ward. Through him, came in touch with the mayor and his committee on highways. In a short time, I found that the politician was a very human fellow and not such a bad sort as I had supposed. Interesting. Now, here's a guy who was not political, but attacks that, gets involved in politics the other way around. In other words, becoming a monopolist. And the whole book is based on this. And he references the idea that if you want to be very rich, politics? No, make politics a business. Isn't that what politics has become? It's always been that to a certain extent. We know that. But I don't think in my lifetime it's become any more of a business than it is now. And so he gets into this idea of making society work for the few. And that's what he says, making politics a business. Interesting premise. He wrote this in 1906. He wrote this in 1906. But then again, when you look on a grander scale, and I make the case in that handout, John F. Kennedy and AT&T. Remember them? Yeah, AT&T. And this fledgling effort, government-sponsored, paid for by the taxpayers, communication satellites. This is becoming a brand new thing here, going into outer space and so on and so forth. And yet, AT&T's domination in communications and through the Kennedy administration were able to take monopolizing control of communication satellites, thanks to the Kennedy administration. Now, keep in mind what else happens here. To create, monopolies are created with government collusion. You have to have a certain amount of corruption in government to create monopolies, because government will protect the monopoly from really price competition. Yeah. And one way AT&T was helped, J.P. Morgan, the banking firm J.P. Morgan. Interesting what J.P. Morgan does. It denies loans or charges higher rates of interest on competing firms to preserve AT&T. Party oligarchs, both Democrat and Republican, will make sure that intrastate tax laws, intrastate laws guiding communications, will preserve AT&T's position to dominate this form of communications. And then on the interstate laws, again, these various party oligarchs, interstate laws will make sure that small companies involved in this field will not grow to become a threat to AT&T. This is an amalgamation of party with corporation. Campaign contributions, that kind of thing. And so the party oligarchs will make sure that certain people running for office will see to this agenda. They get involved, they get in office, whether it's on the state level or it's on the national level. And so this is what Mr. Howe is explaining here. And obviously that example is not in this book. That was written in 1906. This is the early 1960s. So what happened here? It's the same sort of thing? Yes. Well, yeah, but then again, talking about using and part of this is using the currency. Go back to, again, I mentioned this on another different type of talk about J.P. Morgan, who realized, as America is becoming this economic monolith, and I'm going back to the late 19th century, what does he propose? That, these oligarchs can't make money on free market. They can't. But when they rig the system, they can. Now, I was reading another economist, and that's interesting what he calls this. Free market capitalism, where businesses are on that plane. Free market. You live or die by the market, right? And when you can make a few bucks, that's unprivileged wealth. However, if you can create a monopoly situation where a few corporations dominate a market, that's privileged wealth. Interesting definitions here of different facets of the use of capitalism. Interesting here. And so, but again, fast forward today. Is America really free market? She's shaking her head no. Are we... Take a look at China and perhaps even Singapore. Are these examples of free market or state-sponsored capitalism? Yeah, again, look at what Joe Stalin did from 1927-28 to the war. Again, he organized the Russian economy based on the Industrial Revolution. Only Stalin was in control of this. Creating a system of, creating this class of factory workers, but also overseers of the factory system, which some people in the Communist Party or what Communist Party of the Soviet Union would say, well, aren't we creating a bourgeoisie? Yes, we are, but then we will have a true communist revolution, eliminate the bourgeoisie, and the proletarian revolution will come to an end because we'll all be proletarians. What a lot of hogwash this is. Again, this idea of a proletarian revolution, that's not going to work. But going to an industrialized system will work, and that means you're creating classes. You're going to pay the overseers more than you're paying the workers. Well, now we're back to a capitalist system, not a communist system. But here, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller thought that, yes, what we want is to arrange the system, the American economy, to benefit us. In other words, the oligarchs. Not just him, Carnegie, the Morgans, people like this. Now, keep in mind, again, it needs to be remembered that at this point, you couldn't vote for your senators, not till 1913. Your state legislators appointed your senators. So according to Rockefeller's thinking, we can put the pressure on the state legislators to appoint the senators who will write those resolutions, those tax regulations and laws to benefit us. That's not free market. That's not free market. Not at all. That's the construction of a corporate socialist state. And again, go back to what I mentioned, when you get to the First World War, Bernard Baruch with the War Industries Board, hardly related to free market, organizing the economy for a corporatized, commercialized, industrialized war. You're organizing your economy for this conflict by standardizing it. I need so much of this ready for such and such a day, delivered to the ports. And again, all this is organized by government. In fact, even the Wilson administration standardized many products. It's no longer free market. Where's the innovation here? We need these products standardized for the war effort. Does that stymie innovation? Yeah, it does. Well, where's the improvement in the product? It's not going to be. That's standardizing the product. That's counter to what American capitalism really should be about, or innovation, invention, imagination. Does that stifle imagination? Yes. So it's interesting what you're seeing coming down the pike. And then with the Depression, again, going back to standardization, Gerard Swope of GE. Interestingly enough, that agenda, that scheme he puts together, where large corporations and large banks will try to organize the economy to get us out of the Depression. And when Herbert Hoover says that smells like warmed over fascism to me, okay, you know where the money's going during 1932, and who gets elected in 33? Franklin D. Roosevelt, and that Swope plan, and also the War Industries Board that put together by, or chaired by Bernard Baruch in the First World War, will form the basis for the National Recovery Administration by Franklin D. Roosevelt, which in essence amounts to a blueprint for a corporate socialist state. And it's interesting that some of the people who participated in the War Industries Board, guess where they're going to wind up? In the National Recovery Administration, like General Hugh Johnson, people like this. Interesting here what you say. Yes. Based on what you're asking here, corporations and large banks taking control is essentially what you're asking here. Yeah, if you read Benito Mussolini's 1927 charter on the worker, and also his 1932 doctrine on the state itself, the corporate state, yes, large corporations, large banks take control of their industries. They run the economy, and to the point where Mussolini states that the corporation is the highest endeavor in a corporate fascist system. And the worker's rights are based on the fact that he is part of this fascist state. That's the worker's value. So what happened to the idea of individual rights here? It's collectivized into the corporate fascist state. I would say, well, that word fascism can throw people too. It depends on what you're talking about. By comparison standards today, you don't have a real dictator. You don't have a single dictator. Trump can think what he wants. But an oligarchy means what? Leadership by committee. That's what you see here. But then again, how did you get here? How did you get here? Take a look, and again, this gets back to monopolization. You go back to the late 1940s, and you will see that for every dollar you paid in taxes, business and corporations paid $1.50. Today, for every buck you pay, they're paying 25 cents. Again, getting back to this idea of primacy with the money, who is now being asked to pay for the greater percentage of the budget? Oh, I like that word, the proletariat. And so what you are seeing here is a changeover in your economy. So in other words, what I'm telling you is that gets you to another aspect of this discussion. How relevant is voting? Well, yeah. But I mean, to see where this is going, it's interesting, because I did some research here. In 1980, big finance represented some 4 or 5% of the economy. By 2015, it accounted for some 8 to 10% of the economy. Yet it generates 25% of profits in this country. Now, does big finance produce anything? What is its stock and trade? Debt. That's its stock and trade. Interesting here, when you take, according to the Federal Reserve Small Business Credit Survey, in 2015, half of all small businesses had trouble securing financing. That goes back to what this young lady sitting up front here was talking about with regards to homes. Some 32% had to delay their expansion plans. 21% of small businesses had to turn to personal loans to get financing. Interesting here where this goes. Many banks, however, understand where banking is going here. They might not want to lend. You know, that's the old, isn't that how you bought your house? You went to a bank, you put down, I don't know, 20% or whatever the case may be, and you financed it over the term, right? Isn't that what you did? Wasn't that the old standard way a bank worked? Besides lending to business. Well, what are many banks doing now? Student loans? Credit card debt? Why would you want to lend to a business at 4, 5, 6, or 7, even 7%, when you can get into the credit card business and charge somebody 25? But does the business produce things? Yes. Does the debt produce something? Profit for the banks, maybe. And so it's interesting what you see here. It's absolutely fascinating. Control 80, you know, the markets. Interesting here. The banks are fronting the top 10% of the population who control 80% of the markets anyway. Interesting here. They will, in fact, the Standard & Poor's company, Standard & Poor's 500 companies are spending upwards of $1 trillion every year to buy back stocks and control the bond market. Now, why couldn't that money be put into building more productive space, innovation? So what does that do to the American worker? And so where are jobs going? I mean, just a few years ago, I mean, more than a few years ago, but you go back to the 80s, and a General Motors worker was getting paid what? Together with his benefits, I read one economist said they were getting paid between salary and benefits upwards of $71 an hour. But average pay might have been, you know, hourly wage might maybe $35, $36 an hour. Now it's 14. In fact, at one point, it was General Motors. It was costing them at one point for the medical benefits for the United Auto Workers workers, $7,000 a year for each worker. When they transferred some of their production to Canada, don't they have a form of national health insurance up there? The cost dropped to $1,000 a worker. Wow. Interesting, isn't it? Interesting. R&D. Now, this stifles R&D. Where's the money for research and development? Interesting, 1985, 10,000 employees or more accounted for 73% of non-federally backed R&D. By 1998, the share dropped to 54%. 10 years later, 51%. Does this impact business startups? In 1977, there were 257 business startups per 100,000 people in this country. By 1992, this had fallen to 181 per 100,000, and by 2013, there were 129 startups per 100,000 people. Interesting what's happening to the country's economy. Why? Because the few are able to determine where the economy is going. It's fascinating to see this progression. And then you go back to the book, Confessions of a Monopolist. Now, again, you can't have this unless you have government collusion. And so when you go to the polls and you're going to vote for somebody who in 2008 promised hope and change, and then you vote for somebody in 2016 who promises to drain the swamp, since then it's been turned into a toxic waste dump site. That's virtually what you're seeing here. Absolutely astounding here. It truly is. You know, and then what about taxes? What about taxes here? You go back to the 40s, 50s, up to even 1981. Even during the Eisenhower administration, a Republican, the top tax rate was 91%. 91. And I'm sure there's some in the Republican Party today who would consider him a socialist. And, after 1981, then you see the tax rate being lowered to the point where the top rate was what, 35%? But then how many of them are paying 35%? They're not. But then again, this, from what you're talking about, the bankruptcy of the country, beginning with the Reagan administration, you can actually get into, after that, the Clinton administration, when he got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act. And then that, where you had that separation between savings and commercial banks from investment institutions, which in 1933, the Roosevelt administration was smart enough to separate. Yeah, but then who helped draw that together? Lawrence Summer and Robert Rubin. But he's at the whim of those people who control Congress. And it's not Republicans, it's not Democrats. But who pays for them? It didn't make any difference whether it's Democrats or Republicans in the end. Who pays for them? The banks. And that's what they want. And so they open up the country's financial system as a mega ATM for the privileged. That's exactly what they did. And then you get Bush coming along and the tax cuts, which Obama would later continue. Obama was Wall Street anyway. The Clintons are Wall Street anyway. Roosevelt was Wall Street. Only I'll give you that he was a pragmatist. Eleanor was the liberal here, not Franklin. But Mr. Roosevelt, of course, keep in mind the time here. That's not happening now. You don't have competing systems like Nazism, fascism, communism in the 30s. You don't have that now. And so what you're seeing here, and again, another aspect of this is, and I'm a big booster of this, when you go back to World War II, again, controlling the economy, controlling the money, go back to World War II when people were virtually on the same page here. If you weren't at the front fighting, you were in a factory working, but it was for the war effort. People gave up their meat, cheese, sugar, salt, so on and so forth. Gasoline was rationed. People were into this. And so many of your future politicians for Congress were what? War vets. And it didn't make any difference in some respects whether they were Democrat or Republican. They got to the House of Representatives, they got to the Senate. And who were your presidents? Eisenhower was a war vet. Kennedy was a war vet. Yeah. Didn't Reagan come out of the Second World War? Well, Nixon was with the, but Nixon was part of that government-sponsored program to make sure the economy was running right. But the fact of the matter is, many of your elected officials came from an era where there was compromise, or people got together for the betterment of the country. Does that exist now? What happened to that? It's gone. It's gone. And interestingly enough, as this idea of financialization has taken control here, again, the few are making the society work for the few. And so you see this growth of financial, going back to financialization again. Charging many of these kids, these student loans, even if it's only 6, 7, 8%, they can't declare bankruptcy. They're stuck. And on top of that, some of the jobs they went to school for, where did they go? Overseas. And so now they're stuck in this limbo of indentured servitude. Not all of them, some of them. She's asking about, right, you're asking about getting rid of regulations to increase the profit margin of companies. That's what it's going to do. Right. Well, at the same time here, yeah, I mean, what you're seeing now is a deconstruction of the government. Look what's happened to the State Department. And again, EPA is another one. Yes, cutting back on regulations and making it more advantageous for these companies to make money. But does that mean you're going to wind up breathing dirtier air, maybe even drinking dirtier water, and so on and so forth? You say yes. You say yes. But again, getting back to how the market's manipulated, go back to 2006. In March of 2006, Microsoft, get this, Microsoft announced new technologies with computer software, right? The stock market went down, the stock price went down for 2 months. Went down for 2 months. As soon as they announced they were going to buy back the shares, the stock went up 7%. Well, what's happening to innovation here? New product lines. What's happening to that? Where are these investors for innovation and technology? But what are they in for? It's many of them. What I can get today or next week. You know, what happened to long-term investments? You know, hasn't China been trying to plan for the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? Maybe that's what we used to do? Yeah. I mean, Apple Computer was another one, not all that long ago. Apple Computer. You know, what's happened to interest rates? They're dirt cheap. They're dirt cheap. You know, I mean, the Obama administration, during the Obama administration, they pumped $4 to $4.5 trillion into the economy. You would have thought small and medium-sized businesses would have ballooned here. No. Interestingly enough, when you have somebody like an Apple Computer that borrowed a lot of money from these banks, not for innovation, not for investing in in anything like new technology, what did they do? They bought back their shares. It was better to borrow the money and buy back the shares than invest in new technology. And they wound up with a stash of $200 billion in cash. Where is this idea to better the American economy? I don't see it. Maybe some people do, but I don't see it. I don't see it. It's fascinating what's happening here with regard to who controls the money. In fact, tonight I'm going over to this Norwalk City Hall because we as East Norwalkers are against this building they want to put up near the East Norwalk Railroad Station. Where the old, if some of you remember where the old factory store was along the railroad tracks in East Norwalk. Well, they want to put up a 5-6-story building with 189 rentals in it near a whistle-stop railroad station. Now, the East Norwalk Railroad Station is not Westport, and it's not South Norwalk. We don't even have a body there to sell tickets. You get your tickets through a kiosk, a terminal. It's that railroad station. You get on and you get off, and there's no other services here. And when I asked the developers at one of these meetings here, I said, well, let me ask you a question. If these 189 rentals are filled, has a prognostication or survey been done by you folks, a study been done, as to how many of the people in these rentals are going to be using the railroad station? Yeah, 15%. So I said, obviously here, this isn't being built for a whistle-stop railroad station. So what's that going to do to the traffic problem on East Avenue if you're familiar with East Avenue and East Norwalk? And so my counter idea was, well, why don't you have a development of 2 or 3 stories and gear this to the people of East Norwalk? Like maybe a nice neighborhood pharmacy. How about maybe trying to get a grocery store in here for the elderly who live in Roger Ledlow Old Age Home? They don't have to go far. I said, how about an establishment for children? I haven't heard any of that in any of these planning meetings. A place for kids, East Norwalk kids to go. Have small offices, for small businesses, that kind of thing. Something geared for East Norwalk. I said, we already have that that many-story, those rentals you have in the boondocks of where Norton's was, near the railroad tracks on the other side of East Norwalk. Now we got to put another one of these up? What happened to the small-town atmosphere? And there are a lot of East Norwalkers who are against this. But again, and I brought this out, again, this collusion between money and the land developers. These aren't going to be single-family homes. What's happening to land here? Too much land and too few hands. That's part of what's happening with the dollar. Why? Because they can control the money. Again, go back to what John Adams stated. For a functioning system of representative government to exist, the wide ownership of land was a requirement. To me, this is at odds with what's going on here. My wife had an idea. How many here have been on West Avenue in Norwalk lately? That Waypoint development? My wife hates that. She says, you know what I'd like to do? She says, you remember the movie High Plains Drifter with Clint Eastwood? I said, yeah. I said, I don't have money to go buy a lot of C4 if you're going to blow the buildings up. She says, no, I don't want to do that. But if we can get enough people in Norwalk with buckets of red paint, paint the whole building red, and then put a big sign up, welcome to hell. Yeah. In fact, when I was at the last time Mayor Rilling ran for re-election, it was a Romeo. You know, there's some of the guys from Lifetime Learners, Romeos? Yeah, over at Bertucci's, they had him there. And I was talking about Waypoint, and he intimated that, yes, he knew 3 guys renting an apartment at Waypoint paying $5,300 a month. And $5,300? What is in Norwalk that's worth paying $5,300 a month on a rental for? The Maritime Center and Stu Leonard's? I mean, this shows you to me how out of whack it is. I even brought up the point with this development. You know, bringing something into East Norwalk that would make East Norwalk different from the rest of the town. I contacted the State Liquor Commission. And what I did was I said, how many liquor stores are there in Norwalk? Norwalk ranks number 5 in the state for the town with the most liquor stores. 32, 34 liquor stores. No bookstores. And so when I said, how about we have a bookstore? A good one. Like that, and then someone says, well, that won't last. I said, well, there's a hole-in-the-wall bookstore called the Bank Street Book Nook in New Milford. It's not a big, if any of you have been there, it's not a big bookstore, but they have name authors coming in there giving talks, selling their books, and generating conversation with the public. What's wrong with having something like that here? That would set East Norwalk apart from the rest of Norwalk. That's it. Yeah, the Pooch Hotel is there, that place for dogs. And so you see these agendas that really are out of whack here. And it's a drag on the economy and on the people. Again, too few people making decisions at the expense of the mass. Granted, I'll give you the fact that maybe not enough people attend Common Council meetings. Maybe not enough people vote. Did you see the vote in Egypt the other day? Egypt has some 60 million registered voters, and 23 million showed up. Gee, it's nice to see we're better than somebody. Yeah, that's for Bloomingdale's and Nordstrom's. It's supposed to coincide with the ambiance of what's going at Sono. You know, they got the Maritime Center there. You've got these nice new office buildings and apartments, and it's supposed to coincide with that. And I made another remark. I said, that's a bourgeoisie shopping plaza, and everyone else is, all the proletarians are going to go up on on Connecticut Avenue to Walmart. And so we'll have to see how far this goes. But then again, at one point they were supposed to put a hotel on top of those, and now I understand that's not going to happen. And so and are malls closing down in certain areas of the country? Right. Well, if you go back to the early part of the early part of this century, there were 1.8, 1.9 million workers in retail, and I understand the figure's down to 1.2, 1.1. That underscores what you're saying here. It's the change in the economy too. Yes. Well, it's interesting that, again, the change in economy, a lot of it has to do with money. But yeah, if you go up Route 7 and you, again, go to that book nook in the middle of New Milford, that bookstore in Ridgefield has a bookstore. It's been around since 1984. Bigger pardon? Greenwich. Go to Kent. Madison. Kent on Route 7. House of Books. It's been around since 1976, I think. And then you continue up line. But again, it depends on the community too. And it depends on that bookstore. Personally, I'd rather go to one of those bookstores than go to Barnes & Noble. But that's a small aspect of this. But yeah, it's a change in the economy. And so you're right. Many people would rather, but then again, that changes the people. They don't want to leave their home. They'd rather shop from home. But then again, it's emblematic on the change of the economy. You know, we're no longer, many, like you say, some people, they don't want to go to a store anymore. They would rather sit in front of their computer or their little phone and do their shopping that way. Yeah, it is. It is. Which somebody brought that up with that development for that prospective development in East Norwalk. Well, 10% will have to be, you know, affordable. Yeah, but as we go on here, the more of these townhouses, these rentals, whatever, go up, what's happening to the single-family homeowner? Well, that's true. Well, that gets back again to this how again the developers and even on in Norwalk, local government and the developers, that East Norwalk train station where the factory store was zoned for business only to permit the rentals. And that's the meeting I'm going to tonight at East Norwalk. And supposedly this is going to be one of our last attempts here to try to stop this. And so, yeah, it's interesting here, whether it's on a national level or go back to the local level, that, you know, large money begets an issue for the regular run-of-the-mill voter and the common man. Right. Well, yeah, that's part of the issue here. But then again, going back to politics of the dollar here, where are the young going here? And in fact, in January of 2016, you know, as the presidential campaign is beginning to really kick into the election season, apparently 43% of people under 30 have a favorable outlook towards socialism. What does that say for the long term here? The long term. And in fact, there was another poll done, upwards of a group of 18, 19-year-olds stated that upwards of 20% of them said they don't consider themselves capitalist at all. Now, that's not to say that didn't exist before. But what I'm implying here is that, you know, with this too much money and too much land and too few hands, what is it doing to capitalism itself? That's a discussion we should have. Why can't we have that discussion? And again, when I bring back that, when I have that one of those series in the fall, the roadblocks to republic, I'm going to get into that Lewis Powell memo, which no one talks about. It seems no one talks about anymore. And how Lewis Powell came up with this attack on the American enterprise system and found it an affront that perhaps young people, keep in mind, coming out of the 60s here, 1971, not only the students, but even the academics are calling into question capitalism. Well, why can't we call it into question? Not capitalism itself, how it's wielded. That's the discussion you need to have. Not so much capitalism, how it's wielded, how it's employed, who employs it. I mean, go back. I'm sure maybe some of your parents had a mom and pop store, right? Now, they might not consider themselves capitalists, but didn't they have to keep track of their money? Didn't they have to keep track of what they were buying and selling? Yeah, they did. Were they in competition perhaps with another store? Were they making money? Did they live comfortably? There's an example of unprivileged wealth. They did it on their own, perhaps, or went to a bank. You know, when this was how it went, I borrowed a few dollars here, opened up my own business, paid back the loan, and maybe I opened up a second store, or maybe I enlarged the store I had, or maybe I'm selling other products now. That's unprivileged wealth. Going back to how this economist was writing about it, as opposed to privileged wealth, like Trump, who said, my father gave me $1 million. Well, that's a head start. That's privilege. Or even Bill Gates. Didn't his father give him $50,000 to get started? That's nothing against him for that. I mean, if 50,000 is a notable difference from $1 million, I'll give you that. So it's interesting. And then what do both of them do with their money? You got to give them credit to a certain extent. Look what they've turned themselves into. I'll give them credit for that. But then again, do they have the inside track in planning where the economy is going? Yes. That's a discussion I think we need to have. Number one, people getting involved in more in the political process is one thing. But again, here's a great point, talking about how these youngsters protesting automatic weapons and mass shootings. Now, that could start a political agenda. And one of the are they getting a backlash now? Yes. Yeah. What did Rick Santorum say not all that long ago? Correct. But the long-term picture here is, if they can make inroads here, if they can make inroads on the firearms agenda, and they stay politically savvy and they stay in the game, what's next? Student loan debt? Now one would think here, you would think maybe the banks would be on the kids' side here, right? These no, she says, these mass shootings, isn't that taking customers away when these kids go to college for student loans? Yeah, I would say it is. But then again, if these kids become politically savvy enough, could they attack student loan debt after guns? Stay tuned for that. It's going to be interesting because, I've gone to a couple of these rallies just to take a temperature here, right? And I've heard this more than once. I'm 15 and I'm voting in 3 years. I'm sure you heard that one before. Yeah, I do too. It's interesting, and this one girl in particular in Norwalk, holy Christmas, she was shaking her fist. I said, Christmas, this must be Mussolini's daughter. I mean, she was into this. I mean, the eyes were open, the face was getting red. And I said, holy Christmas, they're going to name the EMT here. This kid's going to have a cardiac arrest. When someone asked this before, and again, it revolves around the money and the economy in the end. Who controls that controls the agenda. The problem here is, again, go back to what I mentioned before about Mussolini's corporate state. The corporation is the highest point of a corporate state. It is correct. He says that's a corporate fascist state. Correct. Because, again, you're using the largest corporations and the largest banks to run their industries. Correct. In fact, at one point, by 1939, 1940, the fascist government had 20% of the economy in its pocket. Government and business. The only country that had a higher percentage than fascist Italy, want to take a guess who it was? No, the Soviet Union. Stalin, Mr. CEO of the Soviet Union. And that's interesting, too, when you say, he's not a communist. But the fact of the matter is here, yes, what you're comparing, and I agree with, in part of your comparison here. large corporations and large banks controlling the economy. Different industries, okay? Different companies controlling their industries. However, at the same time, we don't have a dictator yet. We are a committee of oligarchs. We don't have a dictator yet. Trump would like to be. He's a dictator looking for a place to happen. But the oligarchs run in fact, people like Sheldon Adelson and the Kochs could buy and sell that land developer from Queens anytime they want. Well, Eisenhower was a New Deal Republican. He was a New Deal Republican. He had respect for that. Oh, of course it was. But keep in mind here keep in mind what taxes do here. Taxes rein in the appetites of the few because they don't have that money, that grease for the wheels. And so when you lower that and then they send jobs overseas, what can they do with that money? Well, they can buy an extra airplane, they can buy an extra boat, they can do whatever they want with that money, or buy back their stock to raise their shares in an economy that has what, 2% growth? And so where is the innovation and innovation and invention and investment in the economy? It's not there. And it's not going to be there because, as you were mentioning before, some of these jobs are going overseas. That's it. And now at this point, when you hear, no matter who it is in office, well, we're going to bring back some of these jobs. The scheme or the mechanism that has already sent these jobs overseas is too entrenched to change. And so you are, in fact, if we had a population innovative enough, people reinvent themselves, which gets us to another point here. Who controls the internet? Who controls the internet is going to be conducive on what you're talking about. Having the people maybe take control of the economy and take control of their politics. And I brought this up with some of these kids too. Net neutrality, making sure that the net remains a utility instead of having it priced by the few companies that control communications. Well, no, it's not until towards the end of this month where it will really take effect. But but the common everyday Joe, the internet is becoming very, very important for a livelihood. In fact, where I work in Army Aviation magazine, some people have expressed concerns, what's net neutrality going to do to us? And my boss is on the fringe of the military-industrial complex. Figure that one out. Even if the Russians were involved. That's foreign policy gamesmanship. I would expect them to do that. Personally, I would expect them to do that because if you go back over the past decades, look what we did to many other countries. We did the same thing. All you got to do is read the 1901 Platt Amendment to show you what the United States did to Cuba. It's not a pretty picture. But of course, back then, you didn't have an internet. You didn't have an internet back then. But the basic premise is the same. Take control of a country's political posture and you run the country. That's foreign policy gamesmanship. We were coming on the scene as a global power. Okay, so let's take advantage of Cuba. The sugar interest here? That's what we did. You had your hand up. Yeah, bro. Yeah, your idea here is democracy and capitalism are not in parallel here. Yeah, I know. Maybe we're splitting hairs here, but I find that it's interesting that. When we bring up this idea of capitalism and democracy, and we were founded as a republic. The idea of one candidate likable, one unlikable. Well, of course, when you step back and take a look at this election, you had two political lowbrows. One's a Wall Street Jezebel, and the other is, is a land developer. Let's leave it at that. But both, if this is the best that Democrats and Republicans are no longer parties anyway, they're just denominations of the one party that exists. You've heard me say that in class, the corporate state. And so if this is the best that they can provide, then why vote for Democrats and Republicans and all? Now that leads to another discussion. Changing the political structure. I'm talking these so-called parties. And going back to what you were mentioning about these kids, and that's a very important point. And then throwing in people like Black Lives Matter the anti-fracking people, the $12 to $15 an hour minimum wage people. How about the Iraq and Afghan vets against the wars? You see these grassroots movements, and I'm not talking about things like the Tea Party. I'm talking about real grassroots movements that could eventually foment new parties. New parties. And that will be by who? The people, if they're persistent enough. And that means they have to become more politically savvy. Now, one way, getting back to your question earlier on the economy, how do we change it? How about worker co-ops? Why should we be stuck on that old business model where you have a company with a CEO and maybe 12, 15, 20 on a board of directors determining the fates of 100,000, 10,000 people? Why can't we have, if a company's going to close a factory down, why can't we have the option for the workers to buy that factory? You think they're going to want it to close down? Or business? In fact, I understand in Italy, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand in Italy, you know when you get your unemployment insurance if you lose your job? Well, you got unemployment insurance for 2 years. Apparently, if you got another 10, 11, 12 people who are going to be out of work and going to be getting that unemployment insurance for 2 years, if you got together with them, each of you would get a check for the 2 years, and then you could start your own business instead of sitting back and collecting. No, I'm not saying that'll work here, but in other words, trying to think out of the box, how are we going to jumpstart the economy to benefit the American public? We have to start thinking out of the box here. We have to start thinking out of the box. But then again, going back to your premise earlier, capitalism, democracy, or even a socialist system, if that's what people want, none of them are going to work unless the people take part. None of them will work. None of them. But then again, isn't much of your press controlled? Isn't much of your press controlled? 90% of it's owned by corporate. It's corporate owned. So don't think you're getting everything you need to know there. I mean, I was giving a talk, not all that, it was a few months back, and I talked about how a bean counter at the Pentagon announced the Army couldn't find $6.5 trillion. And holy Christmas, this guy looked at me. I thought his eyes were going to roll out onto the floor. And I mentioned that in 1990, again, controlling the money here. Controlling money is very important. 1990, Congress passed the Chief Financial Officers Act, where these major branches of government were supposed to do an audit and turn it into Congress. Well, isn't that to be expected here? Don't you elect these people to have power of the purse? That's one of the basics of the American system, supposedly. And yet, guess who never did the audit from 1990 till now? Pentagon. That's a surprise? So who really runs the country? You have to ask that question. Although, to give them credit, last December they said they were going to do an audit. How far that's going to go, who knows? But it's 28 years after the fact. That's poor accounting procedures, maybe. I don't know. But that's over a period of years. That's not even the Air Force and the Navy. That's the Army. Interesting what you see here without accountability. Yes. Maybe one of the best ways to answer that question with the dollar is, interestingly enough, between 1979 and 2014, when you look at who's making the money, when you look at that 35-year period, the bottom 20% of the economy, of the people on that class level here, the poor, in other words, when you take into effect inflation, taxation, and government programs, their income went up 69%. The middle, yeah, over the 35 years, their income went up 42%. But then, when you look at the top income bracket, she's putting her finger up 1%, they went up 228%. And so, again, 40 years ago, according to the Fed, 45 years ago, 61% of Americans could have been considered middle class. That is now down to 50 or 51. That's a large drop. But it's who controls the money. Correct. Now we're back to who controls the dollar. Who controls the money? So it's interesting here what's developing. And that gets back to what you're mentioning earlier, more people taking part. That's got to be. Because if you don't take part, you're leaving a void. And you know what happens in history when you leave a void? Somebody's going to fill it. And are they filling it to the benefit of the mass? She's saying no. I said a coup at the house. A political coup at your house. I like it and you admit it. Right. You know, I used to be a Republican. Well, let me answer it this way. I used to be a Republican. And I remember, even during the Reagan years, I remember even back then watching this beginning of this influx of ultranationalists, racists, and people of who I used to construe as being of questionable religious character. And I remember as the elections, as the years proceed here, you know, and these people have a right to be heard in the party. You're not going to let people in unless they want to be heard, right? Okay. However, whenever they put a candidate up to represent their interest, I'm talking like a Santorum or a Huckabee, somebody like this, what did the party do? Well, they had a Reagan, they had a Bush Sr., they had a Bob Dole, they had a Bush Jr., they had a Mitt Romney, they had a John McCain, somebody who could be considered more middle of the road in their eyes. This time in 2015, it didn't work. And so what you've seen develop here, and I was out of the party years before that. I left. You know, you could see, if you really watched, you could see the handwriting on the wall. This ain't working. And then then I was asked. I was even asked by 2 ex-mayors of Norwalk, Democrats. Great, you left the Republican Party. You want to join us? No. Why go from the frying pan to the fire? Not doing that. The long haul is Democrats and Republicans, they got to go. They have got to go. And that's going to happen. You mark my words. The day is coming. Of course it is, one day at a time. Now, some of my Republican friends don't want to be bothered with me anymore. They don't want to be bothered with me anymore. In fact, one of them asked me, how come you left the party? I said, because I don't spell Republican or Republic, which is how we were founded. I don't spell it Fascist. That was the end of that discussion. Yeah, well, you know, again, it doesn't make any difference which party. Who controls the money controls the agenda. It is, but you better be able to buy them out. In today's America, that's what it takes. Well, yeah, but again, that's controlling the message. Edward Bernays would be proud. Well, yeah. Well, yeah, but I mean, every country goes through a series of bumps, and we're no different. You know, we're not immune to this. For those who think we are, well, that goes back to what I mentioned earlier, the World War II generation. You know, Democrat or Republican, there were compromises made. Why? They all come out of that same generation. Sure, I may not quite agree with what you believe in, but, well, okay, go back to Reagan at one point here. Didn't him and Tip O'Neill sometimes sit down? Hey, look, what do we got to do to get this done? Now, do you think do you think that's going to happen today? Oh, of course not. But again, the country itself is different. And part of that is the economy, the money, the politics, and where we're going. And on top of that, it was more of a together country back then. It is not the together country now. And I will offer to you, and I still think that, you know, we got this Me Too, we got the kids, we've got all these different groups, and they're all going where? If the American public ever got together to understand whether you're black or you're white, or Latino, whatever you are, if you're young or you're old, if you're middle-aged, or whatever religious persuasion you are, if you understood that 90 to 95% of Americans do share one thing, they're all workers. That's your commonality. We're all workers. The numbers would be mind-boggling. Understand that we all get a piece of the economy, which we're not getting now. We are all workers. There's your common bind. Makes no difference who you are, how old you are, or whatever you are. We're all workers. Although as some of the economy gets offshored overseas, there's less workers. It's almost 4:30. You know something? We're going to have to close this up because they have something going on here in a little bit. But the idea here is who controls the money is controlling the agenda. Well, that should be the objective. That should be the objective. But there has to be something to fill the void. That's the problem. Yes, I know exactly what you're saying, and you make some valid points here. You make great points. But it's fascinating to see where this is going to go. Thank you very much.